Yeah, so if you kind of want to paint, maybe let's start with the creation story. What's unique about the creation story as presented in the Bible compared to other creation stories that we get from ancient civilizations?
Yeah, so the creation history, as we see it in the Bible, is first and foremost history. It's presented as a history, right? Evening and the morning of the first day, evening and the morning of the second day, so forth and so on. So there's nothing. If you read the myths, you see what mythological actually means. You get a feel for what myth is. And then you turn to Genesis and you're like, oh, well, this is not myth. It doesn't read like a myth. I find it hilarious when people say that Genesis 1-3 reads like mythology. So have you ever read mythology? Because it doesn't read like that at all. It reads like a history. So first and foremost, like theologically, in the pagan myths, you do not have creation from nothing. And in Genesis, you have that right away. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, right? He creates from nothing. And then the earth is without form and void, and the spirit hovers over the face of the deep. And then God speaks, right, with his word, and he creates. In the pagan myths, instead, as we said in those lectures, theogony is cosmogony, which means that the birth of the gods is the birth of the cosmos. So there is no differentiation between the cosmos itself, that is matter, stuff, things, and the gods. The gods are the material. So that's why you have like a Gaia, a Mother Earth, and you have an Uranus or Uranus, right? Heaven. So these are some of the first gods, right? Well, Gaia is the first god besides chaos, right? That is in the Greek myth. And so matter and God are combined, right? In Greek mythology. The same thing in the Babylonian myth, the creation myth, the Enuma Elish. And that one's very violent. And that's also what you see, a huge contrast between the Greek myth and the Babylonian myth as opposed to the Bible, is that in the Bible, everything's serene, everything's beautiful. It clearly comes from a good God who creates things for the sake of human beings whom he loves and makes in his own image. And it is just the opposite in your pagan mythology. In your pagan mythology, you have Marduk in the Babylonian myth, who was like a generation younger of the gods, and he takes Tiamat, the original earth goddess, who like in the beginning was Tiamat, right? There's just earth.
So that's
right?
the Babylonian version of Gaia.
Of Gaia, exactly. Okay. And he overthrows her, and the way I read it, he actually, it says a rear wind. So I think we can know what a rear wind is, what he does there. So he farts into Tiamat's mouth, and she gets all bloated, and then he takes advantage of her then and cuts her up and turns her body into what is, what we know of as the universe with stars and mountains. Her breasts become mountains, and then talks about him putting her crotch up to hold up the sky. So it's just vile, violent. And then when Marduk creates human beings or forms human beings from blood, right? Because the gods have blood, right? He does so specifically in order to make them toil for human beings, to make them, or for the gods, to make them work for the gods. So like, he's not kind. He doesn't love humanity. He doesn't create them in his image, except for the fact that Marduk is evil, right? So he's bad. He's power hungry. He's violent. And so he creates man in that image, but he doesn't create them like to share his glory, to share his power, to share his like governance over the earth. He instead creates them specifically for the purpose of toiling so that the gods can be at ease. It's the same exact thing in Greek mythology. You have Achilles famously who says at the end of the Iliad that it's mortal's lot to labor and to go through misery, and the gods are aside enjoying themselves, right? And that's another just big thing in the creation myths, is that the gods don't love humanity. They might love specific humans. So like Zeus might, rape some woman and then have a baby from her. And he loves that individual mortal, but the gods don't love humanity, right? And the gods didn't create humanity. Marduk does, he forms humanity. But in the Greek myth, there's no creation of human beings in any loving fashion whatsoever.
So in both these myths, both Babylonian and Greek, humans are basically just the slaves of the gods to do things that they don't want to do.
Yeah.
Is that fair?
Yeah.
Okay.
And in a lot of ways, enemies of the gods. So like later on, you'll hear of like the humans making too much noise, right? And it's bothering the gods as they're trying to sleep, and so we need to punish the humans, right? Same thing happens in the Greek myth, that Prometheus, who's a Titan, so kind of like an uncle for Zeus, and who did help Zeus in overthrowing the other Titans. But he befriends men and helps them with their sacrifice so they can actually eat the meat of the sacrifice instead of burning it up to the gods. And then he also gives them fire. And Zeus gets angry. So this is in Hesiod's Theogony. Hesiod is around 700 BC, around the same time as Homer. And he writes the creation myth, or he composes it. And he punishes human beings. And one of the great punishment of human beings, I don't know how they're existing without women. They don't explain that. But the great punishment of human beings is to give them woman. And so and Hesiod actually says, no fit helper.
So the exact inverse.
Yeah, it's the exact opposite, right? So the word of God, the history tells you that woman was made as a helper fit for him. And the pagan myth just absolutely reverses it, makes woman, instead of into a blessing for man, makes her into a curse, the greatest curse that man experiences. That's also the myth of Pandora, which is in Hesiod's other work, Works and Days, where she's just kind of this ditz, stupid, but really pretty. And she comes down, she has a jar. It gets mistranslated box, actually, by Erasmus. And so it comes down to us as Pandora's box, but it's actually Pandora's jar. And opens it up, and then come all the woes and the miseries and so forth on humanity, and especially on man. And so it's like a very negative version of woman. You can't live with them, you can't live without them. But it's especially in a special stress on you can't live with them. They make life miserable. So those are the creation myths. Violent. Everything that exists is a product of death and violence. Everything that exists has always existed, but it's always been like divine. But this divinity is not really friendly to you. It doesn't care about humanity. And then in a special stress on the curse of womankind.
So what does that do? Because maybe next we can go through the Genesis one and obviously show how this is very different. But what happens when you have a civilization that these are the cornerstone stories, right? That you tell your children, that you repeat year after year.
Yeah.
How does that affect then the way that a civilization operates with these as their kind of telos?
Yeah. So if you don't come from God, you're not going to go back to God, right? So people in the ancient world had no hope of going back to God, of having a loving relationship with God, right? That was foreign from paganism. You're going to go to Hades. Afterwards, the gods don't care about you. You can manipulate the gods by giving them gifts and so forth. So you can do a tit for tat, right? I give so that you may give back. Or that's in Latin, that's do ut des. I give so that you may give back. And that's the way they thought about their gods, right? Here, I'll give this to you if you give me this, right? So you're kind of just bargaining with the gods. Because again, they don't love you. They're not going to take care of you unless they have a particular relationship with you, right? And for the vast majority of mortals, that's just not the case, right? So how do you live your life then, right? If you have no real hope of everlasting life, you have no hope that God loves you. If you are coming from nothing and then going to nothing, right? And I mean, the parallels are obvious to pagan America today, right? And the doctrine, the myth of evolution. Right. You came from slime, you're going to slime, right? You're not worth anything, right? So if you're not worth anything, what do you live for, right? And why should you live a good life? If the only reason to live a good life is because you might get punished, that's not really the good life, right? Now, I should say that, I mean, that's how the creation myths go, but you do have all sorts of virtuous characters in Greek mythology and Greek history, right? So they did end up sort of creating the idea of a benevolent God, or at least maybe not a benevolent God, that's going too far, but a God of justice at least. And so you're supposed to live in accord with that, right? But there's no real incentive to do that if you look at the actual pagan mythologies, because you're all going to go to Hades anyway, right? I mean, Hades isn't a fun place, right? There is no real reward in the afterlife.